Last week, I traveled to the unbelievably gorgeous island of Edisto in South Carolina and attended a plein air event. The first painting I did was of this magical, I don't have any other word to describe it, but magical house that had to have been a couple hundred years old, that had been passed down from generation to generation to the current owner. And the owners had this dog, and his name was Gumbo. Only Gumbo spelled the Cajun way of spelling it, which would be Gumbeaux. And he was this rambunctious Labrador Retriever. And at first I thought he was a puppy, but upon asking them, they said that he was 10 years old. And to just be there in this place, in this authentic place, and hear the owner screaming, "Gumbo, get your butt inside!" like in the background while I'm painting. We'll call it an immersive experience. And spoiler alert, Gumbo makes an appearance about halfway through the video. And I ended up titling this painting Gumbo's Home. I thought it was fitting. Anyway, once I get the initial sketch down, I begin blocking in my dark values. This is really helpful. I know everybody says to do this anyway, but what's really cool about doing this on a mid-tone paper like Le Carte is that after blocking in your darkest darks, your mid-tone's already down because that's just the natural color of the paper. So after this step, I like to start adding in some highlights because then I've got some light values, some medium values, and some dark values already all included. And so from there, all I have to do is add in a little bit of nuance. And I don't know why I filmed from my right side. Logically, I know not to do that when I'm painting in the studio, but for whatever reason, when I was out there plein air painting, my brain wasn't able to, my brain didn't have the capacity for that. It could only, handle turning on the camera and then proceeding to plein air paint. Listen, if you plein air paint, you know how hard that is by itself, and to add in filming, it's a lot. But I'll get better. Here I'm laying in the shadows of the house. So another thing with plein air painting is that typically you want to, if you're focused on shadow pattern, you want to get that down first because it will change, and it'll change quickly. And once I get the shadow pattern of the house down, I can begin adding in the light areas of the home. And because the house is the subject of the painting, I want to spend more time and energy on this first. And now that I've got a general light and shadow pattern down on the house, I begin to add in nuance in the shadow areas, and this will add dimension to the house. And when I'm saying these things, this is just what I do. I'm not trying to tell you this is the thing to do. I'm just playing this footage back and kind of tapping into the mindset that I was in when I was painting. At this point, I'm beginning to tie in the foreground and kind of mass in the foliage of the palm trees. And now that I have the trees mapped in, I'm going in with the sky color, and my back is to the sun, so in front of me in the scene where I'm looking, the sky color is very blue and saturated. And once the sky color is down, I can then see in comparison that the roof color was too dark, so I go over and lighten the roof color. Once I roughly have the windows where I want them and have painted around them, I go in with the color for the windows. Here I begin paying closer attention to the shadow shapes that are casted by the trees onto the house. And I'm not sure if you remember from the beginning of the video, but this is the part where Gumbo decides to pay me a little visit.
Oh, Gumbo, come on. Need to come in the house. Come on. Gumbo, no.
Situations like this are what make painting in plein air so much more memorable and exciting than painting in the studio. For the background behind the house, there were a ton of trees and things going on, but I decided just to make the simple, unsaturated green shape and let that be the background, because I didn't want to create too much detail that would pull your eye out of the painting. And then I decided to use that same green and incorporate it within the foliage in the front oak on the right side. Just because, you know, when you use one color, it's always good to use it around the painting in more than one place. And I know typically the background would be less saturated, but because I'm using higher contrast in the trees in the foreground, it still reads correctly. And the trees aren't really my focus anyway, so the less I fiddle with them, the better. Most of what I do from this point on is edge refinement, so I'm either drawing more attention and making the edges harsher, or I'm softening them to take away focus. And because I try not to manipulate pigment after I've put it down, I do this by using value contrast. At this point, I realized I wanted to add in the banister because I felt like it invited the viewer to come inside the house. This is one of the more complicated parts of painting light and shadow. It's those areas in a shadow that are highly reflective, like a window, where you have to put in value that doesn't necessarily read as being part of the shadow. But because that object is so smooth, it's actually reflecting light like a mirror. I found these windows pretty difficult to shape because I was working on a 9x12 piece of lacquer, which is pretty small in terms of pastel sizes because the stick you're working with can only make so small of a mark. So what I did was I used the negative space around the windows and carved the windows out in order to get a smaller shape. And after carving in the negative areas with the soft pastel, I have some pastels in my plein air box, such as Rembrandt's and New pastels, that are a bit harder and allow you to get more fine of a stroke. And then I go in with those and further refine the details that I want the viewer to pay more attention to. At this point of the painting, I realized that my shadows on the house are a little too dark. So I begin to lighten them up with the sky color. So if you think about the color of shadows, think of it as the absence of light. And also the absence of that color being filled by, in this case, the sky is like a big ball of blue light. So imagine that your shadow is being slightly lit by this big ambient bowl of blue light above it. And on this side of the house, I observed that reflected light from the grass was bouncing up and lighting the shadow. And then to tone down that really saturated reflected blue light in the shadow, I use a brown color of the same value in order to tone that saturation down, because I quickly realized that it was a little too blue. Shouldn't be the same blue as the sky. And then using that same brown, I go in and add a little bit of highlight to the trees just to create a little more cohesion with the color. Continuing with this theme, I highlight the bright orange color of the pine straw, and then I continue and add in the lights of the grass. And now that I have pretty much pigment on the entire surface, I go into the areas where I really want to draw in the viewer's eye. So I continue to refine those areas, and the more detail you have in an area, the more it will draw attention to it. So this is the time when I forgo the rest of the painting and only really pay attention to those areas. And this is the finished piece that I titled Gumbo's Home. I really love the reflected light in the shadows and the feeling that I get when I look at it. It really transports me back to Gumbo's home. And here's my excessive plein air setup. The end.